So am I?
So we've got one person anyway. And I'll give it another minute or two before starting.
Okay.
And your name is pronounced McQuitty?
It is.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Gerald.
Hi, Susan.
How are things going?
Very well.
That's good. And here's our faithful. Okay, so I think we can begin. Welcome everybody to our Manor Road speaker series Friday afternoon. We are delighted to have this afternoon Mark McQuitty, who is on the board of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse, which some of you might know as that quaint little building down in the southeast end or an events venue, but it's got a history that's quite fascinating. And so Mark will let us in on that. So Mark, please begin.
No, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Manor Road United Church for inviting me to speak today. And so, as just been said, I've been asked to talk to you about the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation. And a full disclosure, I'm just a board member. I'm not an historian, not a teacher, not a museologist, just a board member and even longer standing volunteer. And I've been accused over the years of having been dead wood for a very long time. Now, I got involved with the foundation over 20 years ago when a friend of mine who was on the board at the time asked me if I could help them raise some funds to repair the roof. I was running a fundraising consultancy at the time, and I've always had a passion for history and architecture, so was intrigued by the invitation. And I also believed it's important sometimes to work with charities or causes that couldn't afford our fees. Turned out the roof didn't just need repairing, it needed replacing. It had to be historically accurate, and it was going to cost a lot of money, around $500,000. So as a volunteer, I put together a little campaign and we successfully raised $500,000 to replace the roof. And as you can see, I'm still involved. Now, there are several reasons why. The main reason is that I believe it's important for all of us to know where we've been, what we've been through, how we got here, what lessons we learned along the way. You know, a good story helps make the case with a little bit more impact. And the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse has a good story. I guess people here know the place exists. Most people in town don't. If they do, it is because they know somebody got married there. I was married there. But for anybody watching or who's going to tune in afterwards who doesn't know, the schoolhouse is on Trinity Street. It's tucked behind Little Trinity Anglican Church, which is the oldest surviving church in Toronto. It was built in 1844, and just up the road from the Distillery District. Now, the most important claim to fame the schoolhouse has, and this is central to everything we do, is that it was Toronto's first free school. It was the home or beginning of public education in the city, something we all benefit from today, but we rarely think about in terms of how it all started. We just take for granted so much of what makes our lives easier. Also, the schoolhouse is one of the oldest buildings still standing in Toronto, and it's been in continuous use in some way, shape, or form since 1848. And while you might not see it if you were standing, on the street looking at it, the schoolhouse is also one of the city's more distinctive structures. It has a church-like exterior, and it's one of the earliest examples of Gothic revival architecture in the city. Now, the original design, the schoolhouse was built in two phases. There's the original 1848 schoolroom, and then there's the West Hall where the weddings take place, which was built in 1869. The design was attributed to Henry Bower Lane, who was an English architect and the man who was also responsible for designing, among other places, Little Trinity Church, which is next door to the schoolhouse, Osgood Hall, and the Church of the Holy Trinity, which you may have seen, which is tucked in between the Eaton Centre Marriott and the Eaton Centre. So the schoolhouse was the beginning of free schooling in Toronto, and it's an architectural gem, but there's a little bit more to it than that. And though obviously not exact, there are parallels with today. This is a bit of an everything old is new again aspect of what I'm talking about, but I think this can tie in to the creation of the schoolhouse in the first place, what happens when there are pressures on communities, and what sometimes leads to those pressures. So what I'm about to share with you may seem like a bit of a digression, but I think it will lend some useful context. We're in the middle of a pandemic now. We think about infectious disease and education, healthcare. Well, this was something that was very relevant in 1847, 1848, and obviously very much so 174 years later. So in 1847, a lot of people don't know this anymore. Close to 40,000 refugees from the potato famine in Ireland landed in Toronto. And at that time, there were only 20,000 residents in the city. So if you think about the strains that imposed on this place, I mean, that was seriously large-scale immigration. Also, the Irish brought with them typhus. So this is interesting. While civic leaders knew that typhus was headed their way along with the Irish, they'd had word from Montreal and Kingston, as the Irish came on ships, stopped at Grosse Ile, and made their way westward. They weren't ready for the magnitude of the problem, and the city's resources were overwhelmed. 1,124 of the Irish, of the 40,000 Irish who landed here died. And that sounds vaguely familiar in terms of what we're dealing with now. Medical professionals and politicians made proposals to expand the Toronto General Hospital, which was located on the current site of Tiff Bell Lightbox, or to build a hospital on what's now the Toronto Islands. These suggestions were rejected by the city fathers. Instead, the hospital surrendered its site for immigrant use, rented site, figured out how to make things work, and so on. Another interesting parallel between then and now, and I'm going to get back to the schoolhouse and its founding in a second. This is just interesting that regulations not only banned the Irish from begging if they moved on to other parts of the city from down near Front Street or the waterfront, but taverns and lodge keepers were obliged to report any signs of illness in patrons of their establishments. Anyway, not all the Irish stayed in Toronto, but a lot did. And for decades afterwards, the locals tended not to view them favorably. The schoolhouse, as we know, is in Corktown, which is a part of the city that it got its name because of the large number of Irish working class immigrants who settled there. This is where I tie it together a little bit. The same city officials who couldn't or wouldn't address the healthcare needs of the Irish were granted the ability by the province in 1847 to raise taxes for the establishment of public schools. And they refused. So Enoch Turner, who was the owner of a successful brewery in the neighborhood, saw a need that wasn't being met by government, and he filled it. In 1848, he built the schoolhouse, which bears his name today. giving the children of Corktown's poor working class immigrants a rudimentary education. And the education was rudimentary. It was just to partially to keep the students occupied, but also to give them some writing and mathematical skills so that they'd be of use in society. Turner financed the school for 3 years, after which time it was publicly funded, and that was until it stopped operating as a school in 1859. Now, as I mentioned, the building has been in continuous use mostly since 1848, and I say mostly because it's been refurbished but I guess it was mostly closed when it was refurbished in the early 70s, and then again 10 years ago or so. Anyway, until the 60s, the schoolhouse was a Sunday school and a parish hall for Little Trinity Church next door. And it was the church that added the West Hall as a parish hall in 1869. The school also served as a recruitment center during the Boer War in 1899. During the Depression, it was a soup kitchen. And so it served people, literally served people. As many as 1,500 people a week were fed at the schoolhouse during the dirty 30s. It was a Little Trinity Church neighborhood youth clubhouse in the 50s, and a temporary meeting place for the Little Trinity congregation after the church caught fire in 1961. In the 60s, it was also home to concerts, community youth programs, performing and visual arts events, and that sort of thing. Now, by the late 60s, with this kind of usage after the fire and just wear and tear, as was so often the case in those days, the building was in danger of being demolished. So in the early 70s, a group of interested community members mobilized to save the schoolhouse. And that was when the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation was formed. They hired architect Eric Arthur to oversee the project. And Eric Arthur, if you haven't heard of him before, well, it was a pretty interesting guy in his own right. He was an architecture prof at U of T. And he didn't just have an interest in conservation and historic buildings. He also was very, very interested in modernism. And he chaired the jury that selected the design for new City Hall, among other things. So after that, the building was restored and operated as a museum and an event facility, and as it still does to this day. So the Enoch Turner Foundation has always been run by volunteers and with minimal overhead. We really are a small group. Over the years, we paid the bills and maintained the building through donations and by renting it out for meetings, events, and weddings. Lots of weddings. Over the years, and anybody who's had to raise money to keep something going knows this, it became increasingly difficult for the foundation to keep the schoolhouse in good condition. We owned and operated it, and think we did a pretty good job, but it became increasingly clear that it wasn't going to get any easier. And so in 2009, the board met and made the decision to offer the schoolhouse for sale to the Ontario Heritage Trust. They agreed to buy it. We sold it to them for $1. And we felt that, the government had greater resources than we did, and they'd be able to do whatever needed to be done. What we did as a foundation was we signed a memorandum of understanding with them. And the MOU has ensured that the group that saved the place in the 70s, kept it going, has an ongoing role in support of not just a schoolhouse. We are committed to education and heritage. But that with the schoolhouse, we'd have an ongoing role with helping out in community outreach, fundraising, marketing and communications, and programming. So that's what we've been doing since 2009, 2010. I'll give you a bit of an idea of what we've been doing for the last little while, what we're up to these days. Over the last couple of years, we've underwritten the refurbishment of the original 1848 schoolroom. We did it in two phases. The first phase, we changed the lighting, replaced a lot of the furniture that's there with original furniture, new blackboards, just the things that made it a more interesting experience to go to and see, but also put more of the original sense of what the schoolhouse was into the room. We just, in fact, completed the final phase of the refurbishment, which was to refurbish or restore the schoolroom desks. And we did that in partnership with Westfield Heritage Village in Hamilton. What we did was we approached them. We approached a couple of others as well, but had excellent discussions with the people at Westfield Heritage Village, which is part of the Hamilton Conservation Authority. And what we did was we engaged them, one historic site really hiring another historic site to do the restoration work, which they did. And they did it for us at cost, and we made a sizable donation return for the work. And what they did was really outstanding. But also, as timing would have it, the work was done by volunteers behaving appropriately during the pandemic. So the pandemic has obviously affected us. That's part of the reason why I also want to tie in, the typhus epidemic, its effect on everybody's lives, including education, which is topical this week. Now, during the pandemic as well, programming, and I know this speaker series it exists for the same reason, we focused on a speaker series of our own. We had ran two sets of what were really panel discussions. The first set of 4 panel discussions hosted by David Crombie in 2020, and more recently, just wrapping up in November of last year, 4 sets of panel discussions hosted by Brian Stewart. And they were quite successful. We built them on the basis of other panel discussions that we've done over the years in conjunction with academics and well-known and well-regarded people from the educational field. Anyway, early on, going back to when the foundation first started programming for the schoolhouse, we initiated a program where students would go to the schoolroom and get the experience of sitting uncomfortably in the schoolroom and enduring a 19th century lesson taught by one of a long line of Mrs. Hendersons. And that continues to this day. Now, we as foundation, we underwrite these programs, and we have a special focus on underwriting the 19th century educational experience for more disadvantaged 21st century students. Now, during the pandemic, Mrs. Henderson went online, and that's something that we're going to continue after the pandemic, if it ever ends, because not only do we get students from the Toronto area, but we're able to take this 19th century lesson taught by somebody in 19th century garb to even the most remote communities across the province. So it's the core of what we do, and we really do take our place as the home of public education in Toronto very seriously. Now, during the last couple of years, because our activities had to be scaled back as we were all locked down, the foundation, in the spirit of Enoch Turner, and this is a little bit out of our orb, but we've been making donations to food charities in the neighborhood with a focus on Regent Park. A couple of other things before I wrap up. Every year, for over 40 years, the foundation has hosted what we call our annual Founders Dinner. Last year was the only time it's been canceled in all of those years. And what we do is we host a traditional Christmas dinner with carols, Christmas stories, and music in honor of the dinner that Enoch Turner hosted in 1848 to introduce the schoolhouse to the people of Corktown. You may or may not know that John Joseph attended this year and gave the blessing. A more recent tradition at the dinners is what we call the Enoch Turner Heritage Champion Awards. And this is where we honor people who've made significant contributions to education and heritage broadly defined, including architecture, the arts, and civic engagement, and the kind of engagement which helps define our collective heritage. This year we honored Michael Meehan, who was supposed to receive the award last year, but as I mentioned, that's really the only year the dinner's been canceled. And this year's honoree, Michael Enright, who has been a longstanding friend of the schoolhouse, and whose late wife, his first wife, was part of the original group of citizens who saved the place from being torn down. Anyway, so through this year's Heritage Champion, back to the beginnings of the foundation. So I think I've covered a fair bit of ground and probably missed a fair bit of ground. I could talk a little bit more about Enoch Turner if you like, but I do want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And I hope that the thoughts were too disjointed, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
It was very interesting. So start off, are there any questions from anybody? So I'm just intrigued, certainly, by the the preservation of it and how you sort of keep, especially in these land-hungry days, keeping. I mean, I'm sure people thought that, oh, I'm sure we can put up something bigger and better here, and yet to hold on to the idea.
I mean, if you're talking about all of development in that part of town, one of the things, what the Ontario Heritage Trust is in the business of obviously preserving historic sites. That doesn't mean that this won't be vulnerable, but the site has been protected, and increasingly it's been relevant because we've been able to draw people into it. One of the things I think that's been a bit of a saving grace for it has been the development around there. It used to be way off the beaten track, and now more and more people live there, and it is just up the street from the Distillery District. One of the, in fact, David Crombie had his Speaker's Corner sessions. One of them was about community activism and the way the community rallied around saving the Dominion Foundry and the original Parliament site, which, as people who know the neighborhood know, has been the site of a car dealership for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting to see, as people are moving into some of these brand new buildings, that there are people there who find the history of the neighborhood interesting too.
Mm-hmm. It's, I mean, we used to have some wonderful architecture in the city, and in some cases they've preserved it by building over it or around it. But the old Toronto series on Facebook is always, you sort of see what used to be and ask why. Um, but it's good that is coming. So just to be clear about fundraising for it, does one become a member of Enoch Turner or something like that?
People are welcome to become members of the foundation, obviously. We don't have, we've been rebuilding our membership for a while. Just for the last couple of years, we've been, like so many organizations, treading water a little bit. But we would welcome members. Obviously, we're interested in people checking in with us and participating in some of our events, lecture series, that sort of thing. We've had a couple of other interesting talks over the last year. In the fall, we had one talk about old restaurants that don't exist anymore in the city.
Oh, yes.
We've done before. One year we commissioned a one-person, one-act play, Charles Dickens talking about education, and that was of interest, not just because it's interesting to see a guy dressed like Charles Dickens reading about what was taking place at the time, but also Charles Dickens in the mid-19th century actually did come to Toronto and deliver lectures. So we've done some interesting things like that. Our fundraising, we've been very successful with raising funds through foundations and some corporations and some interested people. And so what we've done over the years is try to engage people who think what we do is important. I mean, a good example is Hal Jackman, who is a descendant of people who went to the schoolhouse, and so we're in, it goes back that far, and we're engaging people who are just interested in what education is about. So it's mostly finding people who are interested in what we do and engaging with them.
Certainly the being able to see online, I think series that the CBC has done, Road to Avonlea, and that has sort of given people insight into what schools were, and I think be very interesting to, with this modern day, try to teach the same thing and say, just I've seen what some of the old textbooks were like, and it's like, whoa.
Well, that's what that's the wonderful thing about the Mrs. Henderson experience, which has been taking place in that room for close to half a century now. I mean, just to sit in those really uncomfortable seats at those really uncomfortable desks and hear what people were taught. It's we've come a long way.
Yes.
But that's part of why in the discussion I wanted to make the point that government support for things isn't always easy. Community involvement in addressing problems that need addressing is something that had to happen then and has to happen now. That external factors affect these things that are important, and we don't live in little silos. And that really the Toronto we live in today, which is so different from what it was then, is in many ways a continuum, part of a continuum. So the epidemic experience in 1847 has eerie parallels with the pandemic experience that we're going through now.
That's a very valid point. So it's interesting. I mean, I remember in 2020 there was a photo of something of during the Spanish flu, children were getting lessons over the radio or something. So it's interesting how we always seem to manage to adjust somehow.
Well, and over the radio would have been again what seems now like a very primitive, but at the time a pretty space age way of communicating with people. So,
Indeed. So, are there any questions from anybody else? Okay, I just have to figure out who we're seeing next week. Great, we know. It's been a busy week here, getting caught up on stuff. And I certainly enjoyed it. And is there a web page that they could check to see what all might be happening at the schoolhouse?
absolutely. And I should remember the URL, but if you Google Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation, it'll take you right there. And yeah, we've just concluded what we felt was a very successful year, given all of the constraints. And,
Right.
And now we're in the business of working on what we plan on doing this coming year. So do check with us, and we hope you find us interesting.
I'm certainly fascinated by old school systems and that. And anyway, our next speaker will be Malcolm Sinclair, who will be talking about Robert Burns, and the Scottish poet who is always celebrated. It's quite, John Joseph can tell you all about piping in the haggis and all the traditions with it. So I hope you can join us. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Mark, very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.